ways for this project. Next slide. Here is our agenda today. We'll be going through some brief introductions, going through the data, courtesy of the GRC. Ronnie, we'll be listening to a recording from Ronnie Christopher, who is the Ohio AAP's QI consultant, discussing decision-making in QI teams. I'll be talking a little bit about PDSA cycles and kind of going through what those mean and what those involve. A little bit of a discussion on that, and then we will wrap things up. Next slide. All right, if you can, please put your name and your practice or role or whatever you might be doing in the chat box for attendance this time. And Liz, will we have a Zoom poll?
Yes, I just launched
Perfect.
it.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so go ahead and put your names and practices in the chat. And whenever you're done with that, if you could take a brief poll for us, that would be greatly appreciated.
We're about halfway there on the poll, so we'll give it another few seconds and then we'll launch.
All righty, taking a look at the poll. Which item has been the most popular with your patients? Looks like there's a pretty wide range, but most practices are saying the parenting books so far. Those are really great books. I think that's an excellent choice, and I'm glad the parents and the families are enjoying those. I see the board books, multivitamins. If you answered something else and you're comfortable doing so, it would be great if you could put in the chat what that something else is. We want to make sure that, you know, if you're doing something that's different than the rest of the programs, we certainly want to know. If it's popular, then we should be doing that for every program, for every practice. So if you did do something else, let us know what that might be. Otherwise, we will go ahead and keep going. Next slide. And we will be discussing data next. Evelyn, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Are you okay doing data today?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Evelyn Parshi. I'm a researcher on this project at GRC, and I'm going over the data slides today. On this first slide is the data submission update. So for the month of February, we had the data broken down into 2 data points. So the first data point is the 1st through the 15th of the month. And then the second data point is the 16th through the end of the month. We had 20 sites submit data. For the first half of February, we had 392 submissions. And for the second half, we had 374 submissions. So altogether, we had 766 submissions. And these are for clean data. So sometimes when there are issues with the data, like dates are not quite right, so they get dropped off. All right, next slide, please. I just want to take a moment to talk about how the charts are going to be are read. So sites are going to be getting their charts and then in their reports. So this is just to highlight what would be shown in these reports. And an example here is looking at measure 1, the % of women assessed for willingness to opt in to participate. On the top is the measure title. And then on the chart, the trend line shows the % of women that are meeting the measure. And then the x-axis is the month. These months will get fixed. It's not in order right now. But basically, it has the data points with the number of women that are in the denominator. And then there's a footnote that talks about how the measure is constructed. So there's the definition for the numerator and then the definition for the denominator. Next slide, please. Sites would also be getting a data table along with the run charts. The data table pretty much gives the same information. It has the measure on the far left column and then the month. So here we have the data points for the first half of February and then the second half of February. And then it shows the numerator and denominator for the 1st through the 15th, and then the measure, and then the same for the second half, the numerator, the denominator, and then the percent for the measure. Next slide, please. So the next couple slides just highlight some of the data charts. Here we're looking at measure 4, which is the percent of women that screen positive for tobacco use. Here we can see that we started off at 18.2% in the first half of February, and then that dropped a little bit to 13.9%. At the bottom of the chart is some other measures for willingness to quit. We started off at 80.9% and then dropped off a little bit to 76.7% for expressing willingness to quit. We started off at 42.6% and then ended up at 46.5%. So that one increased slightly. And then for those receiving a referral or screening note, we started off at 76.2% and dropped off at 62.5%. One thing I also wanted to mention was that you see that some of the titles are highlighted in red and some in blue. The ones that are in blue are the ones that sites have control over, and the ones in red are more on the individual level, so that it's on the mom. It's not something that sites have control over. So that's the difference between the blue and the red. Next slide, please. On this slide, we're looking at the percent of women who received screening for multivitamin use. So we started off at 90.2% and ended off at 90.9%. So quite close. Didn't really see a huge increase or a decrease in that measure. Next slide, please. So this measure is the percent of women who received a multivitamin sample. Here you can see that by the first half of February, we are 23.7%, and then we ended up at 15.2%. So we dipped a bit on that measure. Next slide, please. This slide is measure number 10, looking at the percent of women who received a referral or screening note for multivitamin use. Here, the data is telling us that sites are not doing referral for this measure, so it's currently at a 0, and we are hoping this can go up as we continue to collect data. And this slide is measure number 15, looking at the percent of women who received educational materials via the prescription for a healthy family handout. We started off quite high at 91.4% and ended off at the end of the month at 84.8%. So hopefully we can see this go back up again. And a couple of reminders. So data is due the 3rd of each month. If it happens to be a weekend, then it's due the following Monday. There are 3 ways of submitting data. First, directly through RedCup, then through that link, and then it can also be submitted by using the forms, the paper forms, and scanning it and submitting that through RedCup. Or you could also fax your paper form to Haley, and she would submit it. If there are any questions, they can be directed to Haley, Shadia, Ali, or myself. Thank you.
All right, Ellen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for going over the data, and thank you for all the explanations as well. Greatly appreciated. All right, next, we were going to have a live presentation by Ronnie Christopher. Again, she's our QI consultant for the Ohio AEP. She was unable to join us live today, but thankfully has done this presentation before. And so we will have slides with her voice kind of overlapping those. So we will talk a little bit more after the presentation, and thank you again for your time. Go ahead, Liz. Yeah. Hey, Liz, I don't think we are able to hear anything. I know I'm not, and then we're kind of getting those messages in the chat as well. Can anyone hear anything?
No, not from my end.
Okay.
Okay, let me see if I can correct that. I went ahead and paused. I will go
Thank
back.
you.
It's playing through for me.
Information here.
Is that better?
So decision-making in healthcare comes down.
Yes, thank you.
It's my personal values and your personal values. My is the patient's perspective, what the patient thinks is important about the decisions he or she needs to make, either for themselves or for someone that they are responsible for. Your refers to your personal values as a provider. As a provider personally, as a provider who leads a care team, the personal values your organization or your clinic or your site actually adhere to, those are the personal values that you bring when you're trying to influence a patient to take care of themselves or someone that they're responsible for. So when these things are in sync, we can usually accelerate good outcomes for our patients. But when they're not, we might have delays in care, or we might not understand why patients aren't doing what we want them to between visits. We might not understand why someone isn't prioritizing something that we think that they should in healthcare. So let's try to dissect that a little bit and see what feeds into those challenges. In this method or theory, there are 4 basic types of decision making. We have principled, virtue, moral sentiment, and consequence. A principled decision maker likes to follow rules. A virtue decision maker likes to prioritize and follow values. A moral sentiment decision maker likes to prioritize decisions based off of humanity. And a consequence decision maker likes to prioritize decisions based off of risks. So I'm going to break each of these down a little further and let's see how they all play out. Principled decision makers like to follow rules and they believe in hierarchy. Laws are really important to them and they put a lot of stock in expertise. Now, they might not always agree with a law, but they will be able to follow it because they think that law and order is more important than maybe a personal conviction or belief in most instances. The pros and cons associated with principled decision makers can sometimes work for us or work against us when we're trying to help them prioritize their health. So the pros can be that they're usually pretty clear and concise and can kind of live easily within black and white. They're generally reliable. They'll follow up and adhere to plans. These are usually the easiest people to get to follow through with a care plan. They'll prioritize a leader's perspective, and they think of leaders as anybody who's giving them credible information, and they like to follow the rules. The cons are that they can sometimes be skeptical if the path is not clear. They may not share important information that might change your strategy. So they fall in line, they like to follow the rules, but they might not think that they should share more information with you that might change your decision about a particular care path you want to put in place. They can sometimes see things as too black and white and don't like to live in the gray, which can be challenging when you have complex decisions to make. And they may seem agreeable, but that might not mean that they're putting concerns forward the way you. So the telltale signs of a principled decision maker sound like this. They'll ask you questions like, what is the evidence? And when they do that, the best thing for you to do is let them understand the sources of evidence that you're using and why you think they're credible. They might ask you, well, tell me the rules, or what are the rules? And so the best thing you can do there is to say, here's how we determine the rules and how we put priority on 1, 2, 3, the things we want you to do. They'll might ask you, what's the process? You can simply go through the steps. Again, black and white works really well here. And then what is your expert opinion? Sharing your credentials and your training can be very helpful because they put a lot of stuff. So when we think about engaging principled decision makers, here's a good summary for you to think about. You can give them permission to ask for help. Let them know that you have a plan and you're happy that they're going to follow it. It's also okay for them to give you information that that you might want to consider before you lock the plan in. Give them clear instructions on how to ask for help. You give them permission and give them instructions on how they do it. This is how you reach out to us. This is where you can raise any concerns, and be clear about the type of information you need from them. So you might say something to them, now I want you to follow this plan, but if you're really starting to feel concerned or not well, or you don't think that you can do the things that we've just put in place and the goals we've set, this is how you reach out to the office, and we'll be in touch with you and help you get back on track. Now let's move to virtue decision makers. Virtue decision makers really put a lot of emphasis on their personal beliefs, and these drive all of their decisions. They are often, but not always necessarily, founded in religious or cultural history, and they seek providers who share similar values to them. They like to make sense of their value and belief system by having options, but they absolutely will make their own decision. So we don't always have a ton of influence here, and we need to think about the pros and cons of working with virtue decision makers. So the pros are when they feel very strongly about the decision and they're comfortable and agree to it, they will usually adhere to it and follow it pretty strongly as well. They almost always have a pretty good support system, surround themselves with people who believe the things that they do, and they're very passionate about their personal views, so you usually know where they stand. The cons are that they can sometimes sensationalize information. They might challenge from emotion versus logic. They may make decisions that are not readily accepted within norms, and they can be about their views, which can sometimes feel a little overwhelming if they're talking to someone who feels differently than they do. The telltale signs of a virtue decision maker are things like this. They might ask you, where do you get your evidence? Now, before you tell them, well, this is the evidence and this is why it's important, you want to seek to understand their belief system so that you can gently share back with them evidence that might be contradictory to theirs. You don't want to diminish their evidence, even if you think it might not be that credible. They might ask you where you get your information from, and it's good to explain, how you've been trained, why you get information a particular way, or how you evaluate the importance of information. So important, though, that you don't want to diminish where they're getting their information from. You just want to offer another view to try to bring them into conversation with you. And they might say things like, I don't trust what you're telling me, or I don't believe it, or they might even sound accusatory and say things like, you're just doing that to have me come back for another visit, things like that. Before you try to address that head on, you want to acknowledge the skepticism. You might say something like, I can see that, we have different different approaches on how we're thinking about the decision that we want to make here together. So let's just think about what we both feel comfortable with. That's a good way to talk to a virtue. So in summary here with virtue decision making, a way to engage them is ask them to share their chosen sources of evidence. So you want to give them the opportunity to come back to you about where they get their information as much as you will share with them or you get yours. Explain why you prefer different evidence. So what your training is, why you prioritize things a particular way, and then outline potential risks. And you might have to take smaller steps with them before you get where you want them to go. So with a principal decision maker, you can have maybe one visit, put a plan in place and have a strong degree of confidence they'll follow it. With a virtue decision maker, you might need to think about other ways to get them to come around, and so it might take a little bit longer. The most important thing here, though, is recognizing upfront you might need a little more time because it will save you time in the end if you understand that up. Okay, consequence decision makers. Now these folks need to weigh risks and benefits, and they want a lot of information, and they need time to digest options. Now, generally, they'll stand by their decisions. When we think about the pros and cons of consequence decision makers, the pros are that they're likely to paint a very accurate personal healthcare picture. They probably would give you more information than you want sometimes. They're likely to investigate options with a very broad lens. They often come in with, information. Well, I read this and I see that this could be a benefit to me, but then I'm concerned about this. They're kind of going back and forth in their head all the time. They'll engage in discussions about how to derive decisions. So they'll ask you things like, well, how soon do we need to make this decision? And what if I don't make this decision in a timely manner? They can discuss risks and benefits with ease. They actually like it. The cons are that they might be frustrated with the process if they don't receive the desired information from you. They may delay a decision because they just can't come to terms with something that feels uneasy, and that can make them look indecisive. So when we think about the telltale signs of a consequence decision maker, they might ask you questions like this. What are the risks and benefits? And then you might want to ask them first, well, how do you feel about taking risks? A consequence decision maker can be risk adverse or risk friendly. It just depends on the topic of the time. So if they're making a decision about themselves, they might be very risk friendly. But if they have to make a decision about their child, they might be very risk adverse, or vice versa. So you might want to understand before you start giving them information, how are they feeling about, taking a potential risk or being aggressive in a care plan? They might ask you a question like, what is the worst thing that can happen? And so at this point, what you don't want to do is say, oh, you don't need to worry about that, because they worry. So what you want to say is, okay, let me help you weigh the pros and cons, and you'd want to try to ease their worry. So again, you don't want to just tell them not to worry, because they are. You're not going to be able to take that away from them. You want to try to understand how to expedite and be efficient with them. You want to be able to say, let me help you weigh some pros and cons, and let's think about where you'll be comfortable making a decision quickly or efficiently. And then they might ask you, well, what else should I be considering? And if you have other extra information that can help them make the decision, you can feel free at that point to. Then consequence decision maker management kind of looks like this. Ask what kind of and how much information they want or need. You should ask these things up front of these folks, because they're going to ask you for the information anyways. If you can get ahead of it, you'll save yourself time. Determine how much risk they are or are not willing to take. Here again, if they're very risk adverse, you're going to have to take a little more time. And if they're risk friendly, you can probably move a little more quicker to decision making. And then encourage timelines to help them reach a decision. You might want to say something like, we're going to need to make a decision by X time, so they can work themselves back and start asking you for the information that they need. So now we'll go into moral sentiment decision makers. These folks are very humanitarian by nature. So their personal gain will always be sacrificed for the underserved or for people who are very important to them. They'll weigh decisions based on the good for all, not just themselves, and they absolutely sacrifice their personal gain. The pros and cons here of the moral decision makers are that they will value time with your staff, and they're generally realistic. They value people's time in general, so they'll also love time with the provider, and they will appear usually agreeable. They're usually very friendly because they are giving of themselves to others. These are service-based type of people. The cons here are that they can sometimes give you a false sense of likelihood for their ability to succeed. I've seen this many times with moral decision makers where moral sentiment decision makers, where the provider says, okay, is everything good? The person says, yes, everything's great. And then their caregiver or, you know, their loved one who's in the room is looking at the patient like, no, everything's not great. And says, doctor, this is going on, that's going on, et cetera, et cetera. So these people are often reluctant to seem like or feel like a burden to you. And we need to help them understand that information is important. They may withhold that information because of the time they think it'll take away from you, or because they just don't want to feel like they should be the priority. And the telltale signs of a moral sentiment decision maker sound something like this. They might ask you, you know, what's your opinion? And then you might want to say to them, whose opinions are important to you other than mine? This will help you understand if they're going to have to rely on a spouse or another caregiver or somebody else who influences them to get to some decisions. And that is important to know, because again, it'll save you time. If you could tell them your opinion, but if your opinion isn't the only opinion they're going to weigh, you want to know who else they're going to be considering so that you can start expediting getting information to that person. They might say, will my decision affect others? So and some version of that, this can also be where they will put a statement out to you saying, I need to do some other things for my other children, or I need to do something else for my spouse, or I can't make a decision without making sure all these other things are in place before I prioritize myself. When those things happen, you want to really help the person understand how taking care of themselves is important, because when they are doing that, they can take care of others better. And then you want to really be able to share associated risks with delaying decisions. Now, often with moral sentiment decision makers, if they have responsibility for somebody else, they might do very well taking care of their child, but they might not take care of themselves. And if you need them to be, you know, they're the best version of themselves to take care of their child better, you might have to address that. So that's something that you'll have to kind of sift out with this type of. So again, with these folks, you want to offer a lot of empathy. They need to know that you really care about them, not just provide them care. You want to let them know about the things you're concerned about if they aren't making decisions timely or delaying them. And you want to keep telling them and ensure to them that they have to take care of themselves so they can take care of others. I think about the being on an airplane and someone saying, you've got to put the oxygen mask on first before you put it on someone else. These folks will absolutely put an oxygen mask on 10 other people before they put it on themselves. And so we have to help train them how to make themselves a priority. Also, make sure when you identify this type of decision maker that you are drawing out of them the things they should be concerned about. So you might not want to ask them closed-ended questions like, is everything okay? It sounds like you're doing good. You might want to say things like, now, if I should be concerned about something, what should I be concerned about? What else is going on in your life? Very open-ended questions where you're encouraging them to have more casual feeling conversations with you. That's when they're likely to give you a glimmer into the things you don't know that you need to know. You might also want to praise them for how well they care for others. That will make them feel confident in themselves and maybe help open up an opportunity to engage them. So as we think about these types of decision makers and using this knowledge, hopefully you've been able to think about your own decision-making style. You probably have a tendency, you can be a little bit of all of these things, anybody can, but each of us has a tendency toward one or the other for certain. I'm personally a consequence decision maker, so I know that I need to weigh risks and benefits all the time. And when I'm working with someone who's maybe virtue decision-making in their style, that might be challenging sometimes, because that person might say, it doesn't matter what the risks or benefits are. This is what you should believe is true. And I might be saying, well, wait a minute, I need to decide how risk adverse or friendly that I am. That's where you can sometimes have conflict. Or if you're a strong principled provider and you're like, this is the care path, these are the rules, this is what you should follow, etc. And you're working with, someone who has a strong virtue decision-making style, you're never going to convince that person to believe what you believe, because they're being driven by their own belief system. And if they're going to stay on your patient panel and you need them to do things differently, you're going to have to find a different way to adjust your style to theirs. So you look for these quick telltale signs, use these slides and go back and think about, am I hearing this kind of talk come from this person? They might be making decisions this way. Think about your own personal style and recognize where some of the stress and decision making is actually what's contributing to a lack of follow through in care plans. Trust me when I say I've done this work multiple times. When you can do this well, you will start to break open. In many instances, you can break open a path to getting a patient on the right path, the right care path that you want them to be on. And then as you adjust your style and you engage patients differently, you'll gain efficiency and you'll feel better overall about your outcomes, because you'll start to see it in your data over time. You'll see that people are, following through, and you'll learn things that you can't see otherwise until you start practicing this way of thinking about the way you interact with your patients. So I hope this was helpful. I'm very sorry that I can't be here in person with you today, but I'm so glad that I was able to share the information with you. And I really encourage you, to think about it and try it, and maybe think about it as a team when you're working with all the people on your team. Do some self-identifying and see if you guys can come together and think about how many different styles you have on the team, and see where you might even be able to improve your decision-making for your processes, your day-to-day processes, because it can work there as well. So take good care of yourselves and take good care of your patients, as I know you always do. Thank you.
All right, Liz, thank you so much for running those slides. Really useful presentation. I certainly saw myself in some of the descriptors she was mentioning, and you probably did the same, as well as, certainly patients, colleagues, family members. So good information, good things to think about. Thank you to Dr. Lazaron, who posted the question in the chat about, will this be available afterwards? The answer is yes. We will have this presentation available on the project website, so you can take a look at it and refer back to it, over the next few months as we proceed on with this project. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today. I get to do the QI corner today since Haley's not able to join us. We will talk briefly about PDSA cycles. Some of you might have heard of these, some not, and that is okay either way. We'll go through what those are and maybe how to start thinking about implementing them in your practice for this project. So next slide. So, all right, PDSA cycles. First thing you can see here is it is absolutely a cycle. It basically one step to another, and then back again. PDSA, so 4 letters, 4 words that they stand for. The first letter, P, stands for plan. So the first step in a PDSA cycle is the plan, describing the change to be tested and how you want to capture the results. So what's the thing you want to make different? And how do you plan on making that thing different? And then, kind of the last thing is how are you going to test, or how are you going to tell that whatever that thing is different? So kind of really going through, your objective and what's being tested, as well as how your plan is going to be for collecting the data to see if that thing changed. The next letter, D, stands for do. If we could go back a little bit, thank you, Liz. do. So actually doing the thing that you just planned, running the test, collecting the results, describing what happens, getting all that data. The next letter is S, and that stands for study, going over the results that you just captured, seeing whatever it is, your plan, your change, your objective, like what happened with that data and what is different now. And then the next or the last letter is A, and that stands for act. So deciding what to do next based on the results. If the thing that you were hoping to happen happened as the result of your change, what do you want to do versus if something didn't happen that you were hoping to, what is your new plan? What will you do different next time? So again, a kind of a continuous cycle whenever talking about change management and quality improvement, about bringing about positive change. So PDSA. Next slide. This should be a pretty short and simple duration. This is not a long, drawn out, years long research project, in a controlled setting. This is real life, real practice, short term, that can be minutes, hours, days, maybe weeks, shouldn't be years, probably not months, maybe a few months, but short duration. Should be as brief as possible for you to gain knowledge that something is working or not. Can be as short as an hour or a day, typically less than a week. Just some kind of short change to let you know that should we be doing this further or not. Shouldn't take super long to document on a form either. Shouldn't be super complicated. Either yes, this thing is working, something is different, or no, this thing is not working, nothing has changed. So next slide. Typically, again, simple, single step, often contains only a segment or a single step of implementation over the entire tool to implement. So, an example could be, having your MA hand out education materials instead of the registration and seeing what that does for patients walking out the door with it, or prepping charts for one day a week ahead of time to see if this improves efficiency, or something like that. Doing something, just one thing different, short term, and again, keeping it small and simple, just to see if that change brings about what you're hoping to see. So again, maybe focusing on this last point, multivitamin distribution, doing some kind of small change about who hands those out, when in the visit, could be an example of a PDSA cycle. Next slide. Again, small sample size, keeping it simple, will likely only involve a portion of the practice, 1 or 2 doctors, 1 or 2 MAs, a few patients, maybe only patients on Wednesday as opposed to the whole rest of the week, for example. Once that feedback is obtained, the process is refined, the improvement can be broadened to include the entire practice. So again, starting small and simple, and then expanding once whatever it is you're doing has been shown to bring about the change you hope. So next slide. So here's just a sample. Again, I'm kind of going through the plan. So kind of just writing down, if you want to take notes, the date that you plan to test, the date that you plan to review data. This is kind of a big improvement piece, but discussing all of the topics in distribution of vitamins. So focusing on those vitamins. The thing that you hope to change, our team will hand out the data collection form and vitamins to all the patients. Again, pretty big thing on this, maybe again, just focusing on vitamins in a specific person to give the vitamins to someone. Again, maybe on a certain day or certain clinic of the week. Next slide. Yep, next slide. Alrighty. Again, thinking about the doing, who is going to be doing this? Will it be the MAs, the nurses, the physicians? What does this look like? And again, this is a pretty big, hefty thing, but keeping it simple, just the MAs, just the multivitamins, a small thing. Next slide. Again, kind of going through that. So the change officially based on this is the MA on our team will review the schedule, place data collection forms for all visits, birth through 18 months of age. At the beginning of the afternoon, they will measure this using data forms and to see if more data forms will be able to be collected. Next slide. Yeah, we can go ahead, Haley. Or sorry, Liz. Slide. Yeah, let's go to the S here. So say you did the thing, say your MA did, either put the forms on the charts for a certain clinic, or she or he gave the vitamins out for a certain clinic. Did the results match your prediction? Were there increased amounts of vitamins handed out? Did more data forms get done at the end of that week than previous weeks? Did more bottles of vitamins get handed out? So did the results match your predictions? Did the change happen? Yes, great. And if not, why not? Maybe the MA was uncomfortable getting the forms on the charts or handing out the vitamins. Maybe the process doesn't work for whatever reason. So figuring out what that is, and then figuring out next steps. Next slide. So, and then those next steps, either, there's kind of three choices: a like it, love it, or scrap it. So the like it is, yes, you think this is probably going to work. Maybe want to do a few more tests just to make sure, but this has potential. The love it is this, it worked tremendously well. There were twice as many data forms collected this week as there were 2 weeks ago. We're going to keep this going and scale it up. Or scrap it, this did not work at all. And we're going to start over and figure out a new process. So those are kind of your options with PDSA cycles and about, how to move forward with those. Next slide. Perfect. Let's see. I think actually we're almost to 1 o'clock. I think we're going to go ahead and skip this if that's okay, Liz. In the interest of time here, we will go to due dates. Again, since we weren't able to have a full discussion, if you have not already, please put your name and practice in the chat. Since we weren't able to call on you, we do want to make sure we document that you were here, and we appreciate that. Wrapping things up, data submission for the next month is due on April 4th. This will be all data for March. The next action period call will be on April 20th. We'll be discussing billing and coding for project topics, as well as key driver diagrams. As far as the coaching call, if you've already scheduled one, great. If not, please email Haley to plan a brief call. And the first PDSA cycle, again, kind of what we talked about, how you hope to bring about change in your office, will be due April 5th. I think that's it. Go ahead. Again, thank you for joining us. We greatly appreciate your time. If there are any questions, please feel free to unmute or post in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. But otherwise, thank you again. Have a wonderful day.